Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind, episode 87.
But when you're in a group, you can be completely hopeless, but the group holds you together. In Africa, they have a saying. They say, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go with a group.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Sean D'Souza. Sean is an entrepreneur and owner of the 3-Month Vacation podcast. He's an expert marketer. He runs the popular blog psychotactics.com. Is also bringing up his niece to be an expert marketer and a whole bunch of other cool stuff. He's a former cartoonist, and he became an entrepreneur to create more freedom in his life to travel and spend time with his family. Welcome, Sean.
Oh, nice to be here. Nice to speak to you.
Do you want to go ahead and tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Well, I grew up in India, and I live in New Zealand now. But at some point in time, I decided that I wanted to design my life in the way. The moment I realized that I could design my life, I set about designing it rather than life figuring out what it has in store for you. And so the way we take our vacations, the way we do our work, it's all based on what we want to do. And I know it sounds really bizarre, but there are a lot of people, or at least a few people that do that. They do that. And I think the whole concept of growing up in India, which was a very Eastern philosophy, and then merging it with a country like New Zealand, which is an extremely Western philosophy, I think that made a huge difference to the way I think and do things. So they're both special in their own way, and they're both irritating in other ways.
That's funny. So how did you find your passion or your mission?
I've always been taught to just do stuff. I know that a lot of people have a list, and strictly speaking, I don't really have a list. Even as a kid, I was just told that my father was ill. I had to go to the hospital with his tests. I was 7 years old. There were a lot of things that only now I could recognize as this was something that was given to me as a gift, the whole gift of responsibility. And the more responsibility I was given, the less I felt the fear of risk. And so going from cartooning to copywriting to then, moving to New Zealand, then dropping cartooning as a career and starting up in marketing, all of these things are seen by outsiders or people who don't know me well as extremely risky. But I don't think my parents even bat an eyelid. My mother would, but not my father.
Just because you were used to doing that as a young kid. Is that what you're...
Yes.
That's
and
awesome.
It's something that I've been studying for a while, looking at, which people take risks and which people don't, and those who are able to calculate risks and those who, have to do a ton of research before they make any small decision. And I found that it really boils down to one word: responsibility. So I think that a lot of the passions come from the factor that parents and teachers and mentors have to have this responsibility to give that responsibility away.
Yeah, that's a tough thing to do as parents. Speaking of that, what was your educational journey? What did it look like to help you discover what you wanted to do? You talked about the difference between the East and the West, but what did that look like?
When I grew up in India, the whole concept was not about how quickly you could get from A to B. It was almost unquestioning. It was like, this is what you have to do. And the whole Eastern philosophy is based on that concept. It's like the Karate Kid. It's, wax on, wax off. There is no
questions.
Why do we have to do this? And how quickly are we going to get there? It's more about, if you do this, then at some point in time, you'll figure it out. And today, I don't know whether India is the same way, but when I was growing up, I think that at least some of that existed, and at least some of that culture existed in my head compared with the question of, why do I have to do this? So growing up, my parents had the option of putting us in just about any school. I wouldn't say that they were extremely well off, but they spent a lot of their money putting us in the best possible school. And I think that combined with the fact that, my father would just bring in the Reader's Digest and bring in, magazines and newspapers. They were always around. So there was always this information explosion happening at our house, combined with the school and combined with the responsibility. I think that it built up a sense of confidence. So I think that responsibility is one of the things that I see growing up in my life. But the second thing was just this unbelievable confidence, because I think that somehow they're tied. The responsibility enables you to get confidence, and then you're not so fearful about things that you have to do. To me, the school education and the college education and all that stuff is nice, but I think it's these intangibles that really were my biggest source of education.
Yeah, I'm kind of going back to your one comment of, when we give children the responsibility, it does create a situation where they feel a lot more self-confidence and they're able to make those decisions. If we can let go of that as a parent or as a mentor, that's invaluable. So what mentors did you have along the way that made a significant difference in your success?
It's hard to pin it down to one person, but as you know, mentors come along the way if you're willing. First, you're kind of just struggling in your own way. You have no idea where you're going or what you're doing. But I think my father and my mother played their role in doing whatever they did. We had an art teacher in school, and I was always, I don't say good at drawing. It's just I started drawing because I was a very shy kid, and I wouldn't speak to people. And that was my way of expressing it, expressing myself. And people would then come up to you and show admiration for your work, and so you got more confidence. But anyway, we had this art teacher, and he would never give me a high score. And it always bugged me because I was drawing better work than the other students. And he said, listen, you are capable of more. You are capable of better stuff. And so he came along and he kind of pushed those buttons which told me, listen, no matter how good your stuff is, it's not about perfection.
Yeah.
Yes.
Comparing it.
When I was just in the final year of my school, we had another teacher, and he taught me this whole concept of diligence without actually teaching me anything. He would give us like 300 algebra equations to do, and then next morning we had to deliver it. And it was like, really?
Oh, wow.
But it got to a stage where I would wake up, maybe 6 months later, and then look in algebra equation and go, I know the answer. I know the answer to that and that one and that one. So we had done thousands of them. And I realized that after a while, what I was doing was he taught me without physically telling me that there is a pattern recognition, that if you do certain things at a certain speed and with certain repetition, you become talented.
Yeah, like that 10,000 hours makes you an expert type.
Not exactly, because 10,000 hours entails making a lot of mistakes. And so for instance, it doesn't take 10,000 hours to become an expert at driving a car.
That's true.
So the reason why we're able to do that is a lot of us drive automatic cars. And so the car is doing a lot of the stuff. And so we don't have to think about it. We could go into a whole podcast on just 10,000 hours. But essentially, if you're able to identify the mistakes, then you don't need 10,000 hours. You need as few as maybe 500 hours or 700 hours to learn any skill. I mean, when I'm talking about any skill, I'm talking about people who say they can't cook or can't draw or can't dance. I'm talking about that kind of thing. They've spent 40 years of their life saying they can't do it, and in 6 months they can.
Oh, wow. So it's just a mindset kind of thing.
It's a mindset. There's a teacher, a group, and a system that needs to come into play. A lot of people spend 10,000 hours because they're trying to do it alone. When you're trying to do anything alone, you make mistakes, and you don't even know you're making the mistakes. But when you're working with a group and a teacher, you, first of all, a group properly set up, it exposes the flaws of everyone. And if you're able to just learn from the other person's mistakes, it's much easier. It's not how school is set up. It's a different kind of group. and then a teacher that kind of moves you one tiny step at a time rather than a teacher that moves you several steps at a time. So, yeah.
Exactly. Let's kind of talk about that as far as how we would like to see our education be more supportive to that mission. Take us down that path.
Okay, so here's the problem with school or any kind of education. Most of the time it's one-on-one. So even when you go to a classroom, you think, well, there are 30 students in the class. That's not one-on-one, but it is one-on-one. That's because when you do a test, you're graded on the test, and then the teacher sees how well you did. You get your test, you look at it, and then no one else sees it but your parents, maybe. So no one gets to learn from any mistakes. At Psychotactics, when we have courses, we teach, things like article writing or marketing or pricing or things like cartooning or Photoshop. What happens is we put people in a group. So you have 5 others in the group, and every single one of them makes a mistake. So they make a mistake every day, sometimes 2 mistakes, and you get to see their mistakes. So instead of them doing an assignment and handing it over to the teacher and the teacher giving it back, everyone gets to see the mistakes. So in a day, you're exposed to about 12 mistakes or 15 mistakes, depending on how fast the group moves. So because when you actually look at talent, people talk about talent as something that's inborn. But my definition of talent is it's a reduction of errors. So the moment you start to reduce the errors, say you can't cook, well, you're making a certain number of errors that is not enabling you to get to that cake or to that dish. And if we can remove those errors, you can cook. It's that simple.
Well, and when you watch somebody else make those mistakes, you don't have to repeat it to actually learn from it yourself. Like you said, it shortens that learning curve because you're not making the mistakes, but you're learning from other people.
Correct.
So.
Yeah. So the first thing is the group. A group environment helps tremendously because it's very easy to give up when you're by yourself. And so the people that reach those 10,000 hours, they are extremely dedicated. They're extremely focused and stuff like that. But when you're in a group, you can be completely hopeless, but the group holds you together. In Africa, they have a saying. They say, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go with a group.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's the first thing. The second is the way the teacher designs everything. Now, most teachers don't realize that you have to break down things to the smallest possible atom size kind of thing so that it is impossible to make a mistake. So if I say to you, move one step, you could move left or right or forward or backward. Now, when I say move to your left one step, then everyone moves one step. And then the next day we move another step. So what we have is this thing called tiny increments. When you're teaching someone, you're actually going very slow. So the teaching mechanism is so pathetically slow, but just enough for the pace of the student. So they don't feel bored or frustrated, but it's very slow. And then execution is at double speed. So when I was teaching my niece, say, her tables, because she was struggling with her tables, what we did was we'd go very slowly over 2 times table and 3 times tables and stuff. But once she got it, then we doubled the speed. So if I said 8 8s, she didn't say 64. She said 64. And so what you've got to do is you have this very slow input, and that's what teachers do. So you have a teacher, you have a system, or the teacher has a system, and then you have a group. And when those 3 are properly executed, you get talent.
That's an interesting concept to think about the way we teach and how to make it a different experience. So can you kind of give us an overview of how you think your paradigm has changed over time with experience as far as your teaching and education goes?
Yes. When I started out with groups, I always thought that the most powerful way to teach someone was through a group. But I also realized that there is a situation where someone can be very far behind. And let's say, to give you an example, say someone is in a room and everyone's speaking Spanish and you're the only one speaking English. And now we're actually talking about some geopolitics in Spanish. Well, the person who knows English and doesn't know Spanish is going to be so far behind, they're not going to figure out anything. And that's changed over the years for me in the sense that I always believed that no matter who it is, if you put them in a group, they can learn. But now I've come to the conclusion that, based on the experience I've had, is that they have to be somewhat on the same page. Not exactly on the same page, but somewhat on the same page. It's not that easy to put a child in a group of adults and teach them what an adult can learn, say, even with a skill like piano or baseball or anything for that matter, any skill. So that's kind of changed over the years, that people have to be approximately on the same page. So that's the paradigm shift for me. That's what's changed over the years. I thought that groups were the only way to go. Well, they're not.
So sometimes having that individualized education really helps catch other kids up to speed or bring them to the same place. Is that what you're saying in a way? Or
yes. Awesome. What I'm saying is that the kid, more than anything else, the kid needs the confidence. I think, see, what happens in life is that as you're growing up as a kid, you have what are called gaps. Now, these could be gaps in education. A kid might know how to spell conspicuous, but not know how to spell wood, like W-O-O-D. And that is a gap. And what happens is that as we're going forward, we don't realize that gap exists. And this is a confidence gap as well. So as you're growing up, you have certain points that where you feel unconfident, and no one has actually stopped and made you confident in those aspects. When you grow up, you find people are insecure. And the reason why is because you start pressing those confidence buttons. So one of the most critical things for a kid is to give them confidence. And the way you do that is to make them smarter than adults.
That's interesting.
So I don't know if you want to go down that path.
Yeah. How do you make them smarter than adults, but also hold to their individual, like you said, their own individual responsibility and kind of taking that on for themselves?
Right. So when I started mentoring my niece, one of the things we were clear about was that she was really backward in the classroom. She was really behind. She is now 2 years ahead of the class in certain respects, in just after a couple of years of mentoring. But the most important thing is that when you're not very good at something, people tell you that. They bring it to your attention all the time. They tell you, you're not very good at maths. You're not very good at drawing. You're not very good at this. And so it becomes a belief system. What you have to do is crush that belief system by making the kid better than an adult, and by teaching them stuff that an adult feels, I better not say anything to this kid because he's smarter than me or she's smarter than me in so many other respects. So what I started doing was I started teaching her about clouds. Now, there is an app for it, like there's an app for everything, but you learn about cirrus clouds and cumulonimbus and fault streak holes and stuff like that. So this, a 9-year-old could step out, look at a cloud and say, hey, today we've got a fibratus. And you would go, what? And she'd say, identify the different types of cumulus clouds, which is fractus and cumulus and stuff like that. And suddenly you're not dealing with a kid, you're dealing with a scientist. And she's spoken to pilots, for instance, and she goes, do you run into cumulonimbus? What height are you flying at and stuff? And the pilots go, oh, goodness,
Yeah.
So
when you created confidence in a certain area for her, too.
Right.
Exactly.
But then we learned, say, countries. We learned the countries and capitals in sequence, and then we did it at high speed. What happened after a while is that she knew stuff that adults don't bother learning or have never learned. And when they're confronted with that, they just back away and they say, this kid is really smart. And then what you have is this swell of confidence where the kid goes, hey, if I can do this, I can do that, and I can do that as well. And then it boils down to doing better in math and English and everything else.
Well, and do you think that being treated different by the teacher makes a difference for them, too,
yes,
in their confidence?
Of course. Absolutely. And this is something that a parent can also work with. So when we did that video, and I can show you the video privately.
I'll have to include the link in the show notes or something.
Yeah, and so my niece, she rattles out 150 countries and 150 capitals in sequence. When I say sequence, she actually starts off with Europe, goes through all the countries in Europe, then goes through Africa, then goes through all the countries in Africa, and so on.
Wow.
So we're not just saying, okay, what's the capital of whatever, of Holland? We're saying we're going through all the capitals in sequence. When I showed that to a couple of her teachers at the start of the term, it completely changed the way the teacher looked at her. And of course, it makes a huge difference. When I showed it to the rest of the family, it changed the way the family looked at her.
Yeah.
So what you want to do is you want to have some of these super bright, intelligent, adult destroying moments for the kid, because that's what makes them think, wow, I'm really smart.
And I have the ability to learn.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the discipline, because to learn 150 countries and 150 capitals, that takes discipline.
That's great advice, a great way to look at mentoring kids. So kind of going on that, I was going to talk about mentoring kind of a little bit later, but how do you think a person can be a great mentor to other people or to children?
I think that we know this as adults, but kids, they look at you. You can say what you like. They think you're a banana. Unless you're actually doing what you tell them to do, they're never going to follow. So not just kids, but adults. When we're doing a course at Psychotactics, when I ask my student to write an article a day, I write an article a day. So the point is that unless you're somehow mirroring that factor, it's not going to happen. They think of you as lazy and they don't follow through. But the moment they see that you're putting in as much effort as them, it makes a huge difference. So I would say there are many ways to mentor a kid. Responsibility plays a big role. Confidence plays a big role. They're picking up all this side stuff all the time. What you're doing, when you're doing it, how you're doing it, how much you're learning. And if you're just there as dictator, it doesn't really help as a mentor.
Wow. So you can't have any hypocrisy in your teaching. You have to model that or else they don't listen.
Yeah, because you're teaching them discipline, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if you're going to go, we're going to go through this very difficult task and you're doing nothing difficult.
All you're doing scrolling on Facebook or something.
Exactly. The kid knows the stuff. By the time they're 6 or 7, they pretty much know everything that you're doing. I mean, you look at them as little tots, but they're completely absorbing everything you're saying.
Yeah, I don't think parents or mentors really understand that. Even the way that you structure your sentences or the way that you phrase things to them. I mean, the slightest little things that they completely and totally get.
My niece rates her teachers. She actually does. She goes, that teacher is a 9. That teacher is a 7. She's 9 years old. She's now 11, but she's been doing that since she was a kid. And I can tell you that you don't have to take a kid. You can take a kitten. You can take a puppy. And in like a week, they know exactly what you're up to, how much they can push your buttons.
How much they can get away with.
Yeah. If a puppy can do that, an intelligent, kid figures out a lot more.
That is great. Great advice. Love it. So do you want to go in a little bit more about your podcast and your website, Psychotactics?
Correct. Psychotactics.com.
And what's the inspiration behind that?
When we moved to New Zealand, I mean, I was still drawing cartoons. I still draw cartoons. I put them in all my books. We use them on our website. The point is that I read a book called Good to Great by Jim Collins. It's a management book. And it said, what can you be the best in the world at? I asked myself whether I could be the best cartoonist in the world. And the answer at that point for me was no. I thought that Calvin and Hobbes, which is by Bill Watterson, I thought that was the best one. And I thought at that point I couldn't improve on it. So I started looking to improve. And we'd also moved to New Zealand. There was a lot of change, good change. I felt more free. And as a result, what I did was I started looking at how I could make my life different, as in I could take more holidays or vacations. You call it vacations, we call it holidays. And I started studying marketing in a big way, reading a lot of books. Jim was reading 100 books a year. I thought, well, if he can do it as an author, so can I. So I started reading 100 books a year. To make a long story short, really, that forced me to look at marketing, and then I started enjoying marketing and understanding what people do. That's how I started up Psychotactics. We've come full circle in the way that now I teach people cartooning, and I teach people, at some stage we'll teach them how to cook Indian dishes and God knows what else. I do what I want to do. I write the books I want to write. I create the programs I want to. There is nothing driven by, what Google wants and what search engines want and stuff like that. It's about what we want to do, because what makes us happy, and then do it really well.
And I love the premise of it is that you wanted more time with your family and more time to do the things that you love to do as well. Isn't that correct? And do you teach people how to do that on your website?
Yes, we do. Essentially, you have to understand that great businesses have an underlying system in place, whether you like it or not. I call it the 3-prong system. So when you look at religions, when you look at great businesses, things that have stood the test for thousands of years, they have a system. And that is, it's based on leverage, on training, and on consulting. When you're working, say you run a business and you're consulting with someone, that's one-on-one. when you speak to an audience, that's training, that's one to many. And then there's leverage, which is like a book or a program, whatever. When you have more of the training and leverage, then you have more time. When you have less and you have more consulting to do, then it's one-on-one. It's like right now, while I'm speaking to you, I can't speak to anybody else. I can't do anything else. But once it goes out, say if this became a product, then for one, it opens up doorways. It also educates people. It's very powerful. But having that system together is what caused us to have this time to take vacations, as it were.
So it's just about creating good systems, is that what you mean? Organizing your time and getting yourself a little bit more systematic versus just kind of floundering around. Do you think we spend too much time just kind of doing repetitive stuff that we haven't developed a system for that keeps us from doing those things? Oh.
Correct. I have a saying that it takes 2 hours to save 5 minutes.
It really does.
Yeah, and often I have to learn a program. For instance, yesterday I installed a program and it took me over 2 hours and all I did was a 5-minute activity. But it saves me 5 minutes today and tomorrow and the day after. And when you multiply that over the year, that's a lot of time.
Spending the time putting in those systems, it saves you time over the long run. Am I understanding?
Correct. It doesn't have to be a system. It could just be that you learn your software better. It could just be that you do something in a way that saves you 5 minutes. But it saves you 5 minutes every single day. And when it does that, that multiplies tremendously, because what people don't understand is that at the end of the day, you're not lazy necessarily. You're also exhausted. So when you tackle something, like for instance, when I started writing for Psychotactics, I used to take 2 days to write an article. That was not an efficient system because at the end of 2 days, I didn't know whether the article was acceptable or not. I didn't know whether I would finish the article or not. I didn't know whether if someone would like it or not. Now I can turn out an article in 45 minutes.
Wow.
And I know that the article is going to be good. I know that it follows a system. I know that it will be accepted by pretty much any blog or newspaper on the planet. That's only half the story. The other half of the story is I have 1 day and another 11 hours to go. I can fill it with anything. I can fill it with just sitting at the cafe or doing some other work or starting another project or spending time with my niece. That's what you call a system. A system where when people say they don't have time, essentially that's a fallacy. There is no such thing as no time. It's that you're running your life in a disorganized manner because the busiest people always have time. So obviously they're doing something that you haven't worked out.
That you're not doing. How do you help people set up those systems to organize that?
Well, the answer to this might seem frivolous, but you have to look at something that you're doing every day. And you just ask yourself, how can I save 5 minutes on this? It might just be a school run. I'll give you an example. I have to drive to my niece's house because our internet connection is pretty bad. So I'm doing this call at her place. Now, if I come down one road, it takes me 5 minutes longer to get to her house. But if I go down another road, it takes me 5 minutes less.
That's
now,
interesting.
I have to think it through. But if I had to do that every day, I would save 5 minutes. And if I could use those 5 minutes in some way, maybe just to meditate, maybe just to do something else. If I spend those 5 minutes on Facebook, then, it's not worth saving those 5 minutes. But if I could use those 5 minutes to do something that is useful to my life, like, maybe just stop and have a cup of coffee or meditate or listen to a podcast or do something, that multiplies 5 minutes a day. Say you spent about half an hour learning every day, just went for a walk and you managed to get 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, 5 minutes, and you cobbled together a half an hour. Well, in a 5-day situation, you're talking about 2.5 hours. Now, I don't know, how many of your audience goes to workshops, but that's like a half-day workshop in a single week.
Wow.
Yeah, because that's how much time, if you go to a workshop, from the point they go, 9 o'clock, 8:30 to 1 o'clock, there's coffee breaks and stuff. But that's a half-day workshop every week.
Wow.
Just by saving 5 minutes at a time.
Well, and I've heard the saying, the difference between the person you are now and the person you are a year from now is the books you read and the people you meet. And if you're spending that time just frivolously, scrolling on Facebook or doing something that has no value, you're really not going to be any different today than you are a year from now.
Yeah, personally, I used to think that people were disadvantaged, but I think that people don't want to succeed. I think that there are those that want to succeed, that want to change their lives, and there are those that don't want to do it. You can give them the system, the method on a platter, and they won't do it. And granted, some of it actually goes back to their youth. The fact that they didn't have that much responsibility, the fact that they didn't have that much confidence, they come to the edge of doing something good in their lives and then they pull back. And to me, it's very frustrating because so many kids are not given this mentoring and this training as kids, and it really affects them as adults. We look at adults, but we don't realize they're just big kids. I mean, you press this button and they jump. You press that button and they get depressed. It's not very hard once you understand people. But you look at others and you can press whatever button you want. It doesn't make the slightest difference. They just keep plowing on. And they know when to take a break. They know when to work. They know when to do stuff. And that's why being a teacher, being a mentor is so critical. And, you can bring some of it back even when you teach adults, but it's much harder. It's much easier when they're kids. They're just, moldable.
Yeah. Well, when we create a lot of mental blocks when we're kids, and then we, like you said, we end up being like self-deprecating and self-destructive with those mental blocks. Awesome. Before we go on, let us take a minute and hear about our sponsors. Changing a paradigm takes some study, but like me, you are probably super busy. That's why we've teamed up with Audible. Go to our website, theluminousmind.net, get a free month of Audible with 2 audiobooks, thousands of titles in exchange for only books that you absolutely love. You too can be learning on the go to keep that fire burning. Welcome back to The Luminous Mind with Sean D'Souza, creator of Psychotactics.com and the 3-Month Vacation podcast. So how do you go about helping people better develop their talents? You kind of talked about that. That's one of your skills. How do you do that?
Well, essentially, we use an online system, but even if you're using an offline system, the one thing that you have to remember, which is something I referred to quite at the start, is that it has to be tiny increments. We talk about something called a safe zone. Now, a safe zone is where people don't feel silly. They don't feel like a kid is usually in a safe zone. The reasons why kids take so many risks because they don't know that they're making mistakes and that mistakes are supposed to be stupid. And so if you go into a school anywhere on the planet and you ask, say there are 5-year-olds or 4-year-olds in the class, and you say, how many of you can draw? And all the hands go up. And then you go back to that very same school 5 years later and say, how many of you can draw? And maybe a couple of hands go up. So what happened in between? The second part of that question is, when they were 4 years old and you go, how many of you know math and how many of you can write compositions and no hands go up? And then you go to 10 and then you go, how many of you can do this? And all the hands go up. So what happened in between? Somewhere someone said algebra is more important than art. Someone said algebra is more important than music. And essentially what you've got to do is you have to now take that kid who is very scared in a way of making a fool of themselves and then say, okay, we're going to do something wrong. Now, the moment you say that we're going to do something wrong, well, no one has to be fearful anymore. So we're going to paint the trees wrong. And you say, that's the assignment. Well, you look at the classroom. The moment you say that to the class, they go, okay, so... And that's when...
Yeah, it can look whatever way we want, and it's wrong.
Exactly, because there are 2 hemispheres in your brain, and one is the left hemisphere and one is the right hemisphere. And one hemisphere is dedicated to rules and order and stuff. And that's what goes into algebra. That goes into grammar, and that goes into this cannot be moved, this cannot be shifted, this is the way to do it. And then we have the other hemisphere, which is creative, which goes, if I could draw a tree wrong, this is what I would do. And that's where you get get the creativity, and that's where you get the safety and the feeling of, wow, I can just enjoy myself. Now, both those hemispheres are as critical as the learning that I got in an Eastern philosophy and then the Western philosophy. And together they make a mix. They make a whole. Whereas when you don't have that kind of situation, what you have is, this is the rule, this is how we draw, this is how we write, and if we break these rules, then we're in trouble. So we won't do it. And your job is to create that safety. So what I do with my niece, for instance, when we work with spelling, is I'll say, spell this word, and then she will say, get it wrong. And I'll go, okay, now this is the right way to spell it, and this is the wrong way to spell it. Let's spell it wrong. The brain actually cannot focus on spelling it wrong. So she tries to spell it right. But at all points in time, what you're setting up for the student is, how can I create a safe zone? Whereas parents do the complete opposite. Mentors do the complete opposite. They go, I think you've got this thing wrong. Instead of saying, let's do some wrong stuff and let's do some right stuff.
That's an interesting thought. Creating that safe zone. I mean, creating an opportunity where it's okay to fail and that we respect that and we're excited about it.
It's almost like when we're doing something wrong, if you do it right, it's wrong. Okay, so say you have to spell the word conspicuous. Well, if you spell it right, that's where you get it wrong. You can spell it any way but the right way. What I learned was, when I was learning a language, I ran into this app by this guy called Michel Thomas. Now, he's dead. It's Michel. And if you want to look it up on YouTube, there are 3 videos there about his life done by BBC. And he was a very closed individual. He wouldn't reveal how he taught his languages. But he had a very good system. He could teach you a language in 10 hours. And one of the things that you watch in those videos is how he creates that safe zone. He goes very, very carefully. He takes the worst students in the class, the students that the teachers say, you were never born to learn a language. They use language like that. They say, you were never born to learn another language. You're hopeless at French. And he says, you give me the worst students and I will teach them. And he basically teaches you the core elements of a language in 10 hours. But the most critical thing is how he develops the safe zone for them. So the first thing he does is he gets rid of all the tables, all the desks, all the chairs. He puts in sofas. He changes the lighting. He changes the way they approach the mistakes, if they get stuff wrong. And the first thing he tells them is, you don't have to remember anything. You don't have to write anything down. You don't have to memorize anything. He says, the job of the teacher is, it's my responsibility, he says. If you get everything right, it's because you worked hard. If you get everything wrong, it's because I haven't been a good teacher. And that's what I sat down and I told my niece on the first day that I started working with her. I said, if you get everything wrong, whose fault is it? And she said, my fault. And I said, no, it's my fault. And she said, cool.
I would say that too. I mean, you just created a situation where she feels really relaxed.
Exactly. And that's how we dance. That's how we cook. That's how we do stuff when we're really good at stuff. We're in our safe zone. We don't have this fear that we're going to get something wrong, that someone is going to tick us off. As a parent, as a mentor, as a teacher, you have to be able to figure out what is causing people to be unsafe? What is causing the students to feel unsafe? And there are several ways of finding this out. One is by sitting down and working out what causes this fear in the room. Desks, for instance, are a terrible way to teach. We sit down near the sofa on the ground, we eat cheese, and we have some snacks, and that's how we learn stuff. We never sit at the table. But when my wife works with her, she sits at the table, at the dining table. We never sit at a desk, ever.
Because do you think that the desks create too formal of an environment? If you have a sofa and snacks, you're a lot more relaxed?
I would say we've done things without thinking it through, but essentially that's been the core of the concept. So you want to take this concept of safety and say, if I were a student, what would intimidate me? And then on a second level, you need to go to the student themselves and say, hey, what intimidates you? And you will be stunned at what intimidates them. When we work with people with courses, when there are workshops, someone across the room might intimidate them. So just by changing the group, they're fine, they learn. Where they're seated might intimidate them. You really don't know. So you have this whole unknown factor that's very individual, that's very related to them. And so you have two parts to the safe zone. The first is what you can identify, and secondly, maybe what the individual can identify or what the group can identify as being intimidating.
That is is interesting. You never really think about the factors that cause intimidation for each person, but definitely taking the education to the lowest common denominator creates a situation where they're open to learn. So is that some of the success that you've seen?
Yes, of course. I mean, because we have, for instance, on our website, we have a button that says, "What bugs me?" We offer people, not everyone, but once a month, we'll give a $50 prize to the best bug.
Well, that's interesting. You're going to have to write that down.
Yeah. At our workshops, we have little Post-its. And if there is anything that bugs you, you just give the Post-it to the person at the back of the room. No one needs to know if something's bugging you. So, for instance, if your neighbor is a pest, well, you can't stand up and go. It's very difficult to go to the organizer or the speaker and say, this guy's bugging me. But if you have this little Post-it, it's much easier. You just hand it over. So you've got all these mechanisms in place where you're creating a safe zone for yourself. At our workshops, people get up. I mean, I am horrified because I'm an extrovert and we attract introverts. I mean, the whole room is filled with introverts. And I'm always mortified because I don't know whether I will say something very extroverted that completely throws them. But they get up and they dance, they sing, they're doing stuff that's more extroverted than introverted. But the reason they do that is because they feel safe.
Wow, that's so interesting. Yeah. I never thought about that. And, you always want feedback, but when you give feedback sometimes, people are, tell me what really bothers you. But when it isn't like a secretive thing, sometimes that creates a situation where there's backlash. We want to get feedback, but we really don't want to hear what people have to say. Does that create a safe zone too? Kind of keeping it kind of anonymous?
Not necessarily. In fact, keeping it very public becomes a kind of feeding frenzy, but from a teacher's point of view, it's really good. So on our courses, we have open feedback, as in you can always complain whenever you want, but at the end of the course, we have a specific day when everyone gives their feedback. So the thing is that when you ask an open question like, what feedback do you have on this course, or what feedback do you have on my method of teaching, that's completely too much of an open question. So let's say you went for a massage today. Well, the elements of a massage are, how were you welcomed? So what was the welcome like? What was the lighting like? What was the music like? What you're really doing is you have to break it down into the elements of the feedback. And now you're going to get specific feedback. And of course, you're still not going to like it because as far as you're concerned, you did the best you could. But, someone will tell you, the piano music playing at the massage, that's not a good idea because piano goes faster and you're trying to relax. You want something more slower. And so now you've got specific feedback that you can fix. And that creates a safe zone because when you say, how did you like this massage? It's much easier to say, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, I would give it an 8. But what was the 2? That actually comes out when you break up the elements. So what we do when we're teaching on our courses is we'll go, give us the feedback about the forum, about the group, about the notes, about the audio, about everything. So you break it up into elements. And when you're teaching kids, you could use the same concept, which is how do you find, how do you find the snacks and how do you find, and you'll be surprised at how much this builds respect between the kid and yourself.
Just being honest and open type of attitude.
Yes, but they're also aware because if they say they didn't like the snack and then the next day you're putting the same thing in their plate, now the respect is gone. And when you didn't ask their feedback, there is no respect either because, you're not paying attention.
You don't care what they think type thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What happens if you can't correct it, though? I mean, let's say if you're giving somebody a massage and you can't correct the music, or you've heard, well, I like piano music from one client, and then so you try that with another and they don't. I mean, how do you find that balance? That's kind of an off-the-cuff question.
Yes, it's not that hard. For certain clients, you could actually tailor it. It depends on how often the client comes back. It's not that hard. We kind of, with psychotactics, we happen to know a lot about crazy things, like we send out chocolates from time to time to our clients, and it costs like $3 for the chocolate and $20 for the postage. So we better get the chocolate right. This person doesn't like fruit and nuts in their chocolate. Well, this person doesn't like dark chocolate. You've got to figure it out. It's not this mass production thing, especially when you're dealing with kids or you're teaching kids. You're dealing with 1, 2, 30, 50. It's not that hard to figure it out.
So that's why you got to kind of keep it lowest common denominator so that you can fulfill those requests.
You can, but then you can also get very specific. You can figure out, okay, this kid, Annie, she actually likes to sit in that corner. So why would I put her in this corner? That's her safe zone. Let her be in her safe zone. And when you've acceded to that request, you're able to then get her to do stuff that is useful for you, for the class, for her education, and so on. So just by saying, no, this is the way it's always been done, sorry, then, well, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, once you take care of one of their problems, they're more willing to bend to things that maybe you have to keep kind of things that you can't change type of thing.
There are so many battles to fight as a parent, as a mentor, right? Parents say, you have to pick your battles. But these are moments where you're actually saying to them, look, I'm actually paying attention to you a lot. And it's not like the kid doesn't understand it. They understand it completely. But often we're too busy to pay attention.
That is true. And we don't even fulfill the smallest request or even care what people think.
Yeah, and these are things where, by actually increasing the cooperation of the kid, by making a safe zone for them, you're achieving your goal, not their goal. But people still go, no. Well, I've always sat at a desk when I was a kid. I trudged through the snow for 30 miles. Well, you're going to trudge through the snow.
They kind of hold on to that pride, letting that
go. I think it comes from a space of insecurity that somehow if I let go, I'll appear weaker. But it's actually strength. It's strength that you're able to give the sword to your opponent and go ahead. If you want to chop your head off or my head off, go for it. It's not as crazy as I just described. Most good teachers, when you actually step into a classroom, the kids know. They know when they walk into that space that this person is in control, that person is out of control. And the teacher or the parent that's always screaming, that's always saying, I can't get this kid to do anything, well, something is broken in that system. And one of the things that is broken is just this. They're not willing to give in. Both parties are not willing to give in because the person with the greater amount of power has not given that power to the other person so that they can return that power.
And so there's always some sort of power struggle against one or the other. Yeah, those are great. So what books, and we kind of talked about that earlier, using your time wisely and really being able to use those systems to free up some time. What books have you read that you find the most influential?
I read a lot and I listen to a lot. I go for a walk every day at about 6 o'clock. We go to the beach. I live near the beach. But even if you don't live near the beach, it's a matter of what you're going to do every single day, because I listen to audiobooks on the way out. We stop for a coffee in the morning and then we come back. And then I either learn a language or listen to podcasts on the way back home. And so there's a lot of information, but it's also cross-pollination. So the book is written in a very structured format. I know I'm not answering your direct question, but
that's fine.
The book is written in a very structured, almost boring format, the audiobook. And then when we return, the podcast is more like we're having a conversation like this. It's almost unstructured, and then the language is structured. This cross-pollination helps me a lot. And then I'll read other books on the Kindle or a physical book or something like that. People say, well, how do you have all this time? Or they say, oh, I really don't like to listen to audio. Oh, I don't have time to go for a walk. Well, essentially it boils down to the factor of how many of those 5 minutes are you saving in a day? How efficient are you at just dropping the kid off to school? When you're driving back from there, are you listening to the radio about some politics that's going nowhere? Or are you listening to a podcast or something that could brighten up your day, teach you something? As I said, my belief is that there are people that want to succeed and there are people that don't want to succeed. Now, having said that, some of the books that did make a big change, one for me was Good to Great. But essentially it was one question in the book, which is, what can you be the best in the world at? And I think that really focused my intention to do the stuff that we're doing right now. So when you listen to the podcast, for instance, the 3-month vacation podcast, it becomes extremely difficult for a competitor to do a podcast of that quality, because while the podcast is only 20 minutes, the music and the production takes 3-4 hours.
Yeah.
and so there's storytelling within it. There are lessons on marketing and business and life. But just for the music, I mean, you're just there and you're going, I don't care if he doesn't come back to say anything. That's the whole point. The point is that you're starting to create stuff that is impossible for competition to copy. And I know this is more business related, but it's very difficult for me to say this book makes a difference. I see it as a synthesis of 1,000 books.
Well, it's really what you pull out of it, right? I mean, like you said, some
Exactly.
people...
Yeah.
See, some people, you could give them all the wonderful material in the world, but if they have the mindset that they're not going to succeed, then they won't pull anything out of it anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's the same thing with audio. You know, some people don't listen to audio because they say, well, I can't make notes. And my point is, look, when you go to a presentation, it's still audio. When you speak to your friends, it's still audio. You just have to pick one thing from it. You don't have to get the whole book down on paper. You know, from this conversation, you say, okay, I'm going to do the safe zone. I'm going to figure out what intimidates my daughter or my son or my student. And you go, let me do that part. Let me just sit down and do what intimidates them from my perspective and then ask them what intimidates them. And that's it. And everything else we said doesn't matter.
Yeah, pulling out tidbits and getting your own spark of inspiration from, is that
Right.
what? Yeah, awesome. So we talked about putting systems in place that help you a little bit more productive, but what other habits do you have in your own personal life that you feel are really helpful?
I do stuff every day. I feel that, you know, I learned this as a cartoonist. It was much easier to do a cartoon a day than to do a cartoon every week. It's much easier today for me to write an article a day than to write it every 15 days. And that is because, for one, at first it's very hard, but over time you get so practiced that you're making those mistakes, fixing those mistakes as you go along. And so there is nothing that I would say is superior to daily practice, even if you're completely goofing up every single day. If you did something without instruction, without anyone looking over your shoulder, with reading no books, just doing stuff every single day, say you did a watercolor every day, in a year's time, you can go back and look at where you started and you will be a lot better.
Well, and do you think that's because it keeps the creative juices flowing? I mean, when you take a break, you know, a few days, all of a sudden you're trying to come back and your head's in a fog and you're like, oh, what was I doing? And do you feel like it just kind of keeps the creative juices flowing when you just keep trying?
It does, but it's interesting that you mentioned when you come back, because that's also a critical part. So what I found with all of the people that I work with and myself as well is that when you come back, you're better than before. So when we did say, for instance, cartooning and watercolors, we stopped, say, in June, and then we started in, say, September. And no one had practiced in those 2-3 months. And when they came back in September, they were better than in June.
Oh,
just
so
like that.
It's mostly of like, what did you learn from that experience and then building upon that?
The brain actually takes some time to catch up with what you've learned. So even if you do nothing, it improves it. Now, this is contrary to what a lot of reports will say. They'll say, you know, if you don't teach kids over the summer break, then their reading goes down. I think that you have to have a combination of intensity and then quiet, and then intensity and then quiet. And it allows the brain to catch up.
That is really interesting. But, you know, yeah, sometimes when you do have a break, you come back stronger and able to do more and better.
Well, you'd never fly in a plane that didn't stop, that didn't refuel, that didn't, you know, get
check
maintenance done. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. The break enables your brain to, as I said, it enables it to catch up. It's fascinating, but you can try this yourself. Critical part is that the intense part has to be really intense. And then it needs to have a break. It can't be this, you know, oh, just let's roll along and then let's have a break. No. The intense part needs to be really intense and then have a break. And coaches do this. They run the athletes through this intense thing. And now it's break. No, we're not running. We're not doing anything today. This is the day off.
And when you don't take a day off, then sometimes you don't perform as well.
You don't, because what's happening is the same thing as what's happening in your sleep. The brain needs time to process. And when you continuously go at it, so when I say do a daily practice or do something on a daily basis, you do that, but then at some point in time, you take a break and then you come back. And it's also critical to figure out how to come back because, for instance, we just got back from Italy and we've been away for 6 weeks now, and it's been very hard. It's been a week now since we've been back, and it's been a big struggle just getting back to the routine. But what you do is you then tackle small tasks, and you get those small tasks done, and you get a little bigger tasks, and then in about 2 weeks you're back to normal.
Yeah, just little baby steps all the time.
Yep.
That's great. What type of long-term goals do you have for yourself? And if you could leave a legacy, what would it be?
The legacy is the books that I want to finish, or that's an endless list, but I keep writing books every year, mostly which we sell through our website, but I want to put some stuff out on Amazon and other places just so that people can learn. So for instance, books on, on talent, on what causes intimidation, the safe zone, those kind of things. So that's probably the best legacy that we can leave behind, which is that we have changed someone's life in a way that we don't even know, that they don't know us, but something has changed because, so for instance, when I'm doing this podcast, it's someone will, just 1 out of 100 people will do that intimidation thing. And
that will change
critical.
Their life.
Yeah. So every day when you do something, you do it in a way that you think, wow, somehow this is going to make a difference, rather than somehow this is going to make money.
Yeah. Because sometimes when we put that priority first, our product isn't as thoughtful and isn't as great as if we're really thinking about the legacy that we're going to leave.
Yes, that's
awesome.
Correct.
Great. So before we say goodbye, do you have any final parting words of advice? And then give us your contact information of how we can get in touch with you.
I would say that if there's one thing that you want to look at is this whole intimidation factor. You want to create a safe zone. It would make a huge difference. The second thing would definitely be a factor of responsibility. I know that I don't know a good word to use here, but we're more cotton wooling our kids than ever before. And it's really stupid because they're going to face a future that is far worse than ours unless something dramatically changes. So giving them that responsibility, giving that confidence is critical. And once they learn to trust you with the safe zone, you can start to give them more responsibility. That's what I'd say. I mean, that's pretty much what I've said the whole episode.
Just to reiterate, I guess what I got out of it is that, if we don't turn over some responsibility, I mean, we try to be these helicopter parents all the time that are just doing everything for our children because we don't want them to have to do pain and suffering. And, we want to be able to basically provide them a stress-free life. We're creating problems down the road that they need to take that responsibility to be able to handle those struggles that are going to come along.
Right. So. Stress is what our brains were built for. It was built to take on stress. But when you don't have that stress, that education of stress as you're growing up, then when you grow up to be an adult, you get stressed. When you look at all the stressed adults out there, it's those that were not given responsibility as kids.
Yeah, it's kind of like never working the muscle and then all of a sudden trying to use it and it doesn't work. Yeah.
Exactly.
That is great. Awesome. So how do we get in touch with you?
There is a book on resistance that we have on our website. So if you go to psychotactics.com/resistance, you can get that. It's a really good book. You can read through it. It shows you what stops you, what slows you down. It also subscribes you to the newsletter. You can always opt out whenever you feel like it. But that resistance book is really with the trouble because it starts to look at resistance from a different point of view, which is that there is exhaustion involved in resistance and other elements that you might not have figured out. And so I would say go to psychotactics.com and /resistance and you'll get it. The 3-month vacation, I would suggest that you go for a walk. The walk is more than exercise. It is actually incredibly important for the brain. There is a book out there called The Brain's Way of Healing, and it specifically talks about people with dementia and Parkinson's disease and a whole bunch of things, and everything comes down to walking. So if you get out of your car, you're going to be a whole lot better. I mean, park as far as you can and start walking. Start listening to the podcast. That's the 3-month vacation.
As you're walking.
But listen to it. Because they're 20 minutes. I mean, that's the whole point. The point is you say, I'm going to finish this podcast and then I'm going to turn around. And incredibly, you get fitter. I mean, the car is, as much as people love the car, it is one of the most destructive things that has afflicted mankind. I mean, you go to countries where cars are not as prevalent, like Tokyo, and you find that people are all fit. They're all eating everything they can see and deep fried stuff. It doesn't matter. So get out of your car and listen to stuff, and it makes you smarter, it makes you fitter, and mostly keeps your brain in shape.
Awesome. Great. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you. I've learned so much just in our conversation that we've had. So I appreciate your time and for coming on and joining us.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about Sean D'Souza and the 3-month vacation podcast, go to our show notes at theluminousmind.net. Be sure to become a subscriber to our free email list and consider joining our program by going to the scheduling tab to become a fire starter today. Help support the podcast by making all your Amazon purchases through the free Amazon widget on our website. Also, sign up to receive 2 free audiobooks from Audible at theluminousmind.net. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Google+. Get our audio content on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. To help us grow, consider telling your friends about us. Leave us a review. Tell us how we can help you so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.